I was in first grade, and finally felt like just a little kid anymore. I was mature and cool, and then I caught a really bad stomach flu and I pooped myself in class. It was already embarrassing enough, having to walk up to my teacher's desk clutching at the weight in the back of my underwear and whispering to her, "I pooped myself, can I go to the bathroom?" Of course, the first row of kids heard me, and a split second later, the whole class knew, and the laughter began. My teacher, Ms. Annie, ordered her student teacher to get control of the class, and then took me to wash up and change at the nurse's office. She stuck around to call my mom and ask her to pick me up, and to make sure that I was okay. Once I had gotten cleaned up, Ms. Annie gave me a scented garbage bag to put my soiled clothes into, and tied it shut as tightly as she could. The smell of my accident was soon covered with a chemical floral smell, which was nauseating, but at least better than the smell of poop. I usually had a set of gym clothes that I could have changed into, but it was Friday, so my gym clothes were at home to get washed. My last PE class each week was on Thursday. And for once in my miserable life, I had actually remembered to take them home. On the worst possible day, I was about to succumb to despair, to the idea of having to sit there naked until my mother arrived to pick me up. Ms. Annie had an idea. Fortunately, the school was run by a church that had various charities, so thinking quickly, Ms. Annie ran next door to the church to see if they had any clothing donations I could wear. A way out of this for me. A flood of relief filled me, and I remembered just how glad I always was that Ms. Annie was my teacher. She really cared about her students. I waited in the bathroom for her to return, just wishing I was home so I could just sleep and end this terrible day. She took longer than I expected, and when she finally returned, she was carrying a huge basket full of clothes. She told me that she was very sorry, but the charity office only had a single basket of clothing that had been properly cleaned and was ready to wear, and it was a basket of little girls' clothing. She didn't want to make me wear anything that made me feel uncomfortable, so she had brought the whole basket back to the nurse's office so I could pick out something to wear for myself. I dug through the basket, my hands encountering an overwhelming amount of unfamiliar sensations. I wished she had just chosen for me and gotten it over with. How was I supposed to dig through all this girly clothing and pick out something that I could wear? All the clothes felt so different. Some garments were soft, others were smooth, and still others, the most upsetting feeling, as far as I was concerned, were stiff and starchy. My whole face burned with embarrassment, and I still felt nauseous and dizzy and disoriented from the flu. Right on top was a very feminine blouse. I looked at it, and knew I was in trouble if this was the kind of selection I was working with. The blouse had sizable puff sleeves and a Peter Pan collar, trimmed with a scalloped edge of lace. The buttons weren't like anything I had seen before. They were tiny pearls, with matching minuscule buttonholes. I looked at it for a while, dreading the thought of having to dig through a whole basket of this kind of stuff, and then choose something, perhaps even something as girlish as this, to wear. Ms. Annie, after a moment's hesitation, tried to reassure me. "It's almost like a boy's shirt," she said, so I set it to one side. What felt like the very next item, I pulled out a green plaid pinafore dress with ruffles along the shoulder straps. I dropped it almost immediately, but my teacher cooed instinctively. "Ooh," she exclaimed, "I think this goes with that blouse." Her words hung in the air, and I realized to my shame that the shirt didn't look like a boy's shirt at all. Ms. Annie was just trying to make me feel better about the selection. So then I started thinking, am I supposed to choose a different top now that I know for sure that it's girly, or choose a different one, or... I felt suddenly afraid that Ms. Annie was now expecting me to choose the dress, because after all, they went together. "I'm not allowed to wear that kind of stuff," I said, but I don't know why I phrased it like that. As my words hung in the air, Ms. Annie seemed to digest them. It probably sounded to her like I always wanted to dress up like a girl, but my parents wouldn't allow it or something. No. I was overanalyzing, right? I dug through and found more blouses, and a few t-shirts that I would have worn, except they were all pink and decorated with cute animals and rainbows and other things that I couldn't possibly wear. I found another blouse, this one long-sleeved with lace on the shoulders and cuffs. So far, that first blouse was looking like my only option. I pulled out a red plaid knee-length pleated skirt and a long bohemian pink skirt with these horizontal panels that scrunched up in frilly ways. Both of these I threw to one side. The whole time, I found myself avoiding a particular item of clothing, a party dress with a black velvet sleeveless top, with a sparkly gold skirt and a big bow on back of the waist. I could barely even bring myself to touch it, and every time my fingers brushed against it, I shuddered. When I finally did have to move it to get to the clothing beneath, I thought it was caught in a bunch of other garments, but then I realized that the dress had built-in layers of white tulle petticoats, layer after layer, all tangled up in each other. Before I could toss it as far away from me as I possibly could, Miss Annie took it out of my hands and shook it a few times to fluff it out. The effect of the petticoats swelling beneath the skirt filled me with horror. As she looked at the dress with clear admiration in her eyes, I was terrified that she was about to make me wear it. After all, didn't she now think I wanted nothing more than to be a girl? Ah, she sighed and smiled. How could anyone give this away? It's so sweet. She turned and smiled at me. Oh no, here it comes. Should I take it home for my daughter? I didn't know how to reply, so I just sighed in relief and kept just digging through the basket while Miss Annie laughed. Oh, she would never wear it, she's such a tomboy. And yet, of course, here it was, in the only basket of clothing I had available to wear. To make it even worse, instead of throwing it into the pile of things that I wasn't allowed to wear, she laid it out carefully next to the basket, as if presenting it to me. I think she realized she was embarrassing me, because she was mostly quiet after that. Finally, I found a pair of jeans. They were obviously girls' jeans, with flowers embroidered all across the legs and on the back pockets, but at least they were pants. I still couldn't find a top that didn't just scream girliness in some way, but I eventually settled on a blouse similar to the first one, no puff sleeves or pearl buttons, but still with a Peter Pan collar. That one really did almost look like a boy shirt, especially in comparison to all the other clothes. I put the blouse on, and began looking for underwear. Oh no, I moaned to myself. Oh no, no, no. That's when Miss Annie dropped the real bombshell. I'm really sorry, but this is the only clean underwear I could find, she said, and held out a pair of panties. Almost immediately, terror blossomed in my chest. They weren't just any pair of panties, not just plain white cotton, which wouldn't have been so bad. They were a very light blue, with darker blue lace trim at the waist and leg holes. And right on the front, where I was used to having a little opening to pee through, there was just smooth, seamless fabric. Upon it was an image of a dancing Cinderella emblazoned upon it. The only underwear I had available to me, held in my teacher's hands and offered to me as if it was a lifeline, was a pair of Disney princess panties. Even worse, the panties were a little bit faded from multiple washes, so I could just imagine some girl wearing them before she outgrew them. The idea that I, a cool, mature, first-grade boy, was going to have to wear something that a little girl had outgrown was horrible, but I reminded myself, I was a cool, mature, first-grade boy. It was my responsibility to weather the difficult moments of life with some measure of bravado. I took the panties from my teacher and shrugged, as casually as I could muster. It's okay, I understand, I said. I'm so sorry, Miss Annie said. She held them open for me, and I stepped through the leg holes, unable to suppress the tremors of fear that passed through me. How could this be happening to me? I was a cool, mature, first-grade boy. I liked things like wrestling and X-Men, not Cinderella. It's going to be okay, Miss Annie said. There. I knew none of this was her fault, so I couldn't get mad at her. I couldn't just go around the rest of the day naked. Miss Annie pulled the panties on, very quickly, as if ripping a band-aid off. Immediately, I felt the lace tickling my legs and waist as I shuddered and squirmed. I looked down at myself and saw my own body wearing a girl's blouse and Cinderella panties. I let out a single choked sob, and Miss Annie patted me on the back. You're being very brave, she said. It's just for a little while, and then your mommy will come to pick you up. I nodded, holding back the tears that I knew had to fall at some point. But even now, I was determined to be okay with things. My mom would be here soon, and all would be right. With all that in mind, I felt confident enough to proceed, and went to put the jeans on, only to find that they were way too small. I should have been able to tell from looking at them. Maybe it was the flu making my brain foggy, or maybe it was stupid dumb hope, but even wiggling and pushing with all my strength, I couldn't get the jeans more than a couple inches past my knees. The leg holes were just too small. Ms. Annie watched me struggle in silence for a few moments. "I don't think they fit," she said. I wanted to scream at her, "Don't you think I know that?" But she had been so kind and comforting, and I felt horrible for ruining her day, so I nodded meekly and pulled them off. My eyes darted around the room as Ms. Annie began searching through the basket, and I crawled across the floor, looking through piles of clothing. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," Ms. Annie said. "There just aren't any pants." About now is when I truly started losing it. I pushed past Ms. Annie and dove back into the basket, sure that she had missed something, sure that somewhere there was another pair of pants, or shorts, or maybe a bathrobe or anything. "I'm sorry," Ms. Annie said. "It's going to have to be one of these skirts, or maybe a dress." The thought sent me reeling. My fevered brain panicked, repeating over and over again, "I don't want to turn into a girl, I don't want to turn into a girl, please don't make me dress like a girl. I'm going to turn into a girl." I kept thinking of a mess. Annie talking about how the pinafore dress and the first blouse with puff sleeves went together, and I saw them sitting in a pile off to the side, and suddenly felt like that's what I was supposed to wear, as if she had set them aside to remind me that they went together, that they had been right there on top, as if they were waiting for me. I gravitated towards them, as if hypnotized. "Is that what you want to wear?" Ms. Annie said, sounding surprised, but not unhappy. "No," I cried, but had no explanation as to why I had started reaching for the pinafore dress and ultra-girly blouse. I scrambled for a way to cover my tracks. I just thought. I racked my brain, trying to figure anything out, but I drew a total blank. I just thought, maybe I could wear a shirt as pants, instead of having to wear a skirt. What do you mean?" Ms. Annie said. I winced, knowing that what I suggested was completely absurd. I picked up the girly blouse, felt how soft it was. It wasn't cotton like the one I was wearing, but of something silkier and smoother that seemed to slide through my fingers. "That could work," Ms. Annie said. I knew she was lying, but it was too late. I had to commit. I turned the blouse upside down and stepped through the armholes as if they were the legs of pants, and then pulled it up so the elastic bands of the sleeves were just above my knees. Ms. Annie clapped a hand to her mouth, and I could tell that she was stifling her laughter. She must have seen in my eyes that I was about to cry, because she immediately coughed, and when she moved her hand away from her face, she wore a serious expression. "I don't think that's a good idea," she patiently explained, and then pointed to the blouse I wore on my legs. "Everyone could see your underwear." I looked down, and realized my grave miscalculation. Shirts didn't have 2 holes, they had 3. And right in the middle of the upside-down Peter Pan collar of the least girly blouse, I could see my panties poking through, lace trim and dancing Cinderella on full display. I dropped the blouse in horror and frantically kicked my legs out of it, sending it across the room. Somehow, that had made it all even worse. Now Ms. Annie probably thought I was so in love with girly blouses that I was compelled to cover my entire body with them. "I think the pinafore is your best option," Ms. Annie said. "It won't be so bad." Yes, it would be. There was no way out. With all other options closed off to me, I stood there and screamed at the top of my lungs. There was nothing else to do but throw a tantrum, and with it went all of my claim to being a cool, mature, first-grade boy. I was still just a toddler, who would scream and cry if things didn't go my way. I was immediately humiliated by my outburst, but I didn't want to stop. All of my fear, desperation, and anger had built up, and now they needed to be released. I wanted out. I tore at the blouse I was wearing, kicking and screaming frantically as the buttons got stuck. With a tremendous heave, I ripped as hard as I could. The buttons flew off, bouncing off the walls and out of sight into a pile of clothing. I kept tearing, but couldn't manage to rip the fabric, so I eventually just stood there, breathing heavily. Well, Ms. Annie said, much of the kindness gone from her voice. Are you done? I nodded weakly. Those were donations, she sighed. They were supposed to go to the less fortunate, but look what you've done. I obeyed, and felt like crying again. How could I have been so thoughtless? How could I have lost so much control? I can't choose. I cried, unable to find the right words to express all of my feelings. I thought about saying, I don't want to turn into a girl, but the words felt silly in my mouth, because it was just clothes, right? Okay, Ms. Annie said. Then I'll choose. I nodded in relief, until I saw her reach for the pinafore. She still thought I would wear it. No! I cried out. I'll never wear a dress. I don't want to. I won't. I won't. Don't throw another tantrum now, Ms. Annie snapped, and dealt me a hard smack to the bottom. And if you don't like that, then... She picked up the party dress. I didn't dare speak again. I only complied when she ordered me to take off the ruined blouse, and held my arms up as she lowered the dress over me. As it descended, I looked up, and saw only tulle descending on me. Over my body it descended, over my upraised arms, the stiff fabric making me itch as it came down. My flailing hands found soft velvet, which was soon pulled down over my body, so that my chest and shoulders and arms were all wrapped in some of the softest fabric I had ever felt. The golden skirt was made of a shiny pleated satin, and the bow was made of sparkling fabric, and beneath them I had lost all sight of my feet. I stood there, stifling sobs of shame and dread, while Miss Annie fluffed out the petticoats until they covered my legs down to the knee. I was grateful to find that my legs weren't exposed to the itchy tulle, for the dress had heavy lining beneath all the layers to protect the skin. But then I realized there was something I enjoyed about this dress. Something I was thankful for. A dress. A dress I was wearing. The horror of it became overwhelming. My greatest fears were coming true. I was becoming a girl. Before I even knew I had passed out, Miss Annie and the nurse were crouched over me, the nurse shaking me gently and cradling my head off the ground. Oh my gosh! Are you okay? My teacher was asking over and over again, and I kinda nodded, and didn't really believe it. I held my arms up expecting her to take the party dress off, but she only took my hands and helped me to my feet and leading me into the nurse's office. The bathroom had been private, but now out here, anyone could just walk in and see me. I struggled and fought against the nurse, sending my dress rustling and shaking around me, but I was so weak that she didn't even notice. The fever made everything at this point feel like a horrible nightmare, and all I could do was ride it out. The nurse sat me down on a comfy couch and handed me a bowl. Just in case you throw up. So I sat there, clutching the bowl to my chest, staring at my distorted reflection. When I rested the bowl, I felt it mush down the petticoats onto my knees, tickling them and making me feel sick. I raised the bowl, but then I had to clutch it to my chest, which rubbed the velvet against my skin, sending renewed shivers of revulsion down my spine. The nurse and Miss Annie exchanged a few hushed words that I couldn't quite hear, and then Miss Annie left without so much as a farewell. I looked after her in utter despair. The nurse sat down beside me, and put a comforting hand on my shoulder. To my horror, she explained to me that my mom had finally called them back. I hadn't known up till this point that there had been any trouble contacting my mom, and that she had been at a doctor's appointment downtown and would be there in about an hour to pick me up. I looked at the clock and struggled to make out the time. It was almost 3 o'clock. That meant I would be there until almost 4, which was even later than on a normal day. As I was thinking about how unfair this was, I felt the nurse reach behind my back. At first, I couldn't tell what she was doing, so I didn't raise a protest. I assumed she was going to do some kind of examination on me to make sure I was okay. Instead, I soon realized she was buttoning the dress up in the back. It was all I could do to stop from screaming out loud. The velvet pulled across my chest, and I felt the neckline come up to its proper height, above my collarbones. I squirmed and wiggled to try to get more comfortable, but with every movement the dress's collar pulled tightly at my neck. Even when the nurse stopped fiddling with the buttons and went back to rubbing my shoulders, the feeling of tightness didn't go away. It was something that I would have to feel for as long as I was stuck in this dress, this compression of fabric that seemed to mold the velvet to me like a second skin. How long I would be trapped, I had no way of knowing. I felt like I couldn't stand another second of it, but the nurse went on, rubbing my back, stroking the velvet into my shoulder blades, reminding me of just what I was wearing. My legs didn't reach the floor while I sat on the couch, so they just dangled, bare and half wrapped up in petticoats. The humiliation of that moment was incomprehensible. Having to sit there like a perfect dainty little girl while with this oblivious nurse kept talking and talking. "I'm usually on my way home by now," the nurse said, smiling, "but I'm going to stay as long as I have to take care of you, okay?" "Where's Miss Annie?" I asked, still half expecting for her to return triumphantly with a basket full of fresh clean boys' clothes. She had to go back to class, to teach her classmates, and give them all their homework, all that end-of-the-day stuff, the nurse said. "It's okay, I'll take care of you. It's like our special after-school club while we wait for your mom." She handed me a little paper cup full of medicine, and I took it, vaguely recognizing it as the same kind of medicine my mom would give me when I was sick. When I finished choking it down, the nurse stood waiting with a glass of water, which she handed to me. "You need to drink water, okay? Always remember, when you're sick, the best thing to do is drink lots of water." "What about medicine?" I asked. "Well, medicine is good, but water is God's medicine," the nurse said. Something about her earnest kindness made me trust her. The nurse hadn't been there for the whole situation, so I had to try to explain it to her. In my fevered state, with all of the shame and horror still so close to the surface, I couldn't come up with a coherent sentence, so I just kind of mumbled, "I didn't want to wear this dress, but Miss Annie said I had to wear it." "Oh, I'm sure she didn't say that," the nurse said. "No," I agreed, kind of nodding. Miss Annie hadn't said that, she had just held it out for me, and I had let her put it on me, and even if she had done that, was it her fault the church only had girl clothes? In any case, it didn't matter. At last, I said, to clarify everything, "But I don't want to wear this dress." "Did you want to wear that other dress?" the nurse said. I tried to protest, but the nurse disappeared into the bathroom for a while, and I heard her shuffling around. After a few moments, she emerged holding the laundry basket full of clothes. Right on top was the pinafore dress. "Here, I'm sure it'll be more comfortable than that fancy thing you're wearing now," she said. "But I see why you wanted to wear it. It's very pretty. It's not every day a girl gets so lucky. Look at that, you get sick. You get to play dress up. Isn't that a lovely treat? For a pretty little girl to play dress up at school?" I know she was trying to make me feel better, but it cut me to my core. Somehow, Miss Annie hadn't told her I was a boy. Or, the fear that lay smoldering within me again leapt to life. Had Miss Annie told the nurse I was a girl? Whatever it was, I knew in that moment that as far as the nurse was concerned, that's what I was, a girl. I wasn't a boy wearing a dress. I was a girl, who was lucky to get to play dress up. I didn't know which one was worse. I was almost catatonic as she tugged a privacy curtain closed around the couch, and then helped me to my feet. In my fevered brain, all sorts of wires were getting crossed. If the nurse thought I was a girl, and she was the only other person there, who was to say that I wasn't a girl? She was so nice to me, and she thought I was a girl. I had the feeling that she wouldn't be nice to me if she knew I was a boy. That was a horrible thought. Better she think I was a girl wearing a dress, and not just a dress, but the girliest dress I had ever seen. And here I was, wearing it, making me the girliest person I had ever seen. Was there even a boundary between being girly and being a girl? I just didn't know. All I knew was that I was hating every second of it. Before I knew what was happening, the nurse had unbuttoned the dress, giving me a moment of sweet relief. Then she went, arms up, and I instinctively obeyed. For a long moment my vision was obscured by petticoats, and then I stood there dressed only in my little Disney princess panties. She didn't bat an eye, she just began rummaging through the basket of girls' clothing. "That pinafore is wool, so it might get itchy," she said. "So you should wear a slip under it, along with a blouse." A slip? I asked. I had no idea what a slip was. I stood there, feeling more vulnerable than I ever had in my life. She ignored me, and just kept digging through the basket. I thought I saw a knee-length slip in here, aha. The nurse turned around, holding up what looked to me like short white cotton dress with broad lacy straps across the shoulders. A small bodice would cover the chest, beneath which hung a long skirt, looking very heavy and solid. Along the bottom of the slip was a span of lace and embroidery. It was one of the most delicate, girly things I had seen, something boys weren't usually privy to. I had passed beyond the external trappings of girlhood, and was moving into its higher mysteries. The nurse squinted at the slip and shrugged. It's probably a little bit too fancy for an everyday dress like this, but it'll have to do, she said. Put this on first, dear. By the time your mom gets here, she won't even know you're sick at all. My mom, the fear froze my thoughts in their tracks. What was I supposed to do? I had to tell the nurse that I was a boy. I had to beg her to help me, to ask her to look high and low for boy clothes before my mom got there. But I couldn't just come right out and say it. And wouldn't the nurse judge me for staying dressed as a girl for so long? For almost encouraging her to help me play dress up? I knew that no matter what, I wasn't getting out of this with my pride intact. I took the slip from her hands, trembling with fear. Even as I stood there, holding the lip and staring at it, wondering what to do, the nurse picked up that first blouse I had picked up with puff sleeves, lacy Peter Pan collar, and pearl buttons and held it at the ready. I had to think fast, before her belief that I was a girl turned me into an actual girl. I said the one thing I knew that could get me out of the situation, a solution so brilliant that I knew I should have thought of it sooner. I have to poop really bad, I lied. I dropped the slip on the couch, and ran past her into the bathroom. Then I could stay there, all the way up until my mother arrived. I would whisper a hasty explanation to her, she would understand the nightmare situation I had been in, and that would be that. I shut the door and sat on the toilet, pulling my panties down instinctively, leaving them coiled around my ankles, tickling my feet like boy underwear never could. As soon as I was sitting there, I heard the nurse knock on the door. Don't be embarrassed if you need any help, the nurse said. I won't. I called back, fighting to keep the panic from my voice. Her footsteps retreated. A few minutes into my self-imposed exile, I heard a knock on the nurse's office door. Muffled voices spoke, but they were still clear as day. Hey, is this the nurse's office? A male voice said. Yes, can I help you? The nurse replied. I was told that the nurse's office needed some boys' clothing, the man replied. Marcia over at the church said a teacher was in there looking for clothing for a student, and they only had girls' clothing available, but they found this basket of boy clothes sitting in the laundry room all clean, and thought they would send it over. I bolted off the toilet and yanked the panties back up. I knew I had to run out there, to grab the boys' clothes and put all of this behind me. But, the panties. I looked down at myself. I couldn't wear them out there. The nurse and the man would be scandalized, and it would be even worse if I then announced that I was a boy. Oh, there must have been a misunderstanding, the nurse laughed. It's okay. We don't need any boy clothes. A student, well, this poor girl caught that flu that's been going around, and she had, the nurse whispered this next part, an accident. I ran to the door, yanked my panties down, and got ready to run out there, then I immediately yanked my panties back up. The thought of running out there naked somehow even more embarrassing. What would I look like? Feverish and naked and demanding boy clothes. They would think I was a total freak. Oh, no, the man said, sounding genuinely sympathetic. The poor thing. Well, it's all right, the nurse said. I gave her some ibuprofen to help the fever break, and now we're using that basket of girls' clothing to play dress up while we wait for her mom to come pick her up. And just like that, I knew it was too late. The nurse had established that I was a girl beyond just our interactions. Now it was two people out there, believing that I, the person currently hiding in this restroom, was a girl. It was spreading. I had a sudden vision of my mom arriving to pick me up, and rushing to comfort me, as her daughter. What if the news spread throughout the world that I was a girl, and suddenly that's all the world knew? My mom would take me home, and she would change me into a nightie like my sister Mia wore, or used to wear. She was 10 years older than me, and she would sit me down on the couch with a mug of tea and put on a princess movie. That's what she had always done for Mia, so now surely that's what she would do for me. Her other daughter. The girl. And in another flash, the vision was gone, and I opened the door, took a step outside, ready to rush to the couch, grab the blouse, put it on, and then go out there, at least partially clothed, to explain the truth to everyone. If this continued, my fate would be sealed. Well, should I leave them here anyway? The man asked. The school could always use backup clothes for situations like this. Yes, yes, yes. Please. Please leave them. I prayed, but to my dismay, the nurse declined. Oh, no, the nurse said. Those were donated. Let them go to someone who actually needs them. I had to be brave now. I had to rush out there to get to the boy clothes, but it sounded like the man was physically holding them. I would have to bolt directly at him, wrestle the box away, and then rush back to the bathroom. Then I could get dressed as a boy and everything would be okay again. But I would be seen, and after I was seen, I would have to explain everything, and I just couldn't think of a way to do it without coming off as a freak. I pressed myself back against the wall, stifling a whimper of despair. The nurse lowered her voice, still talking about me, and how delightfully girly I was. You should have seen her. She immediately wanted to put on this adorable party dress. Little girls can never resist looking like a princess. With that, I retreated to the bathroom. I'm a little girl, I realized. It was nobody's fault, but that's what had happened. As far as at least 2 people were concerned, I was just a little girl. Sounds like she's in good hands, the man said. I'll take these back, and we'll get them to someone who needs them. Thanks for coming over here, the nurse said. Goodbye. I heard footsteps, and then the man was gone. I took the opportunity to slink out of the bathroom over to the couch. The slip, blouse, and dress were all there, waiting for me. The nurse came back to the alcove, and I looked past her. Just a glimpse. That's all I got of the friendly man from the church who held a box of my salvation. I saw him turn the corner with a box under his arm. As he turned the corner, he smiled and nodded to someone out of view, and then he was gone. Did everything go okay in there? The nurse said. Yeah, it was just a little bit of toots, I said. For some reason, that made the nurse giggle. Oh, that's such a rude thing for a little girl to say, she said. Now come here, let's get you all nice and dressed up. With every opportunity of escape gone, squandered, or otherwise lost, I had no choice. I picked up the slip, fingering it gently, feeling how soft it was. I shuddered at the thought of feeling it against my skin, and especially dreaded what it might feel like under other things, rubbing constantly against my body. This first? I asked, hoping that she would change her mind. It'll keep your legs from itching, and it'll help the dress keep its shape, the nurse said. Go ahead. With nothing else to do, I pulled the slip over my head and shrugged it down on my shoulders. Just as I suspected, the feeling was horrible for me. The slip waved with every movement, surprisingly heavy, making the straps tug against my shoulders. I realized suddenly that I was wearing only girls' undergarments, panties, and a slip. I could have cried, but the shock was just too much. I couldn't believe this was actually happening to me. I was so terrified of delving into girlhood, but I was even more terrified of revealing that I was a boy. And now the blouse, she passed it to me, and I put it on, wincing at the delicate feeling of the puff sleeves around my shoulders. With slow movements, I fastened its little round pearl buttons all the way up to the very top, beneath my chin, trying to delay the inevitable. This was far worse than simply wearing the blouse and pinafore dress, like Miss Annie had suggested. How I hated myself for giving in to all my rage. Now I was being forced to go out of my way to dress properly as a girl, slip and all. As I dallied, the nurse bunched up the pinafore dress and prepared to lower it over my head. Arms up, she said, and I was humiliated to discover that even before she spoke, my arms were already raising, slowly, reluctantly, as if accepting what was about to happen. I didn't struggle as the nurse pulled the dress down over my head and smoothed out the skirt. The ruffles of the straps only seemed to accentuate the size of the puff sleeves, and I gasped at the sheer feminine volume of the clothing I was being made to wear. "Oh, you look darling," she said, completely oblivious to my horror. "How do you feel?" She turned me around and began buttoning me into the dress. I squirmed a little, but couldn't bring myself to do anything else even as the dress grew tighter and more secure on my body, crushing the blouse and slip against me. The blouse felt so soft, sliding over the starchier cotton of the slip. Both of them were now wrapped around my body, growing tighter and tighter as the dress closed around me. With the buttons slowly tightening in the back and the girlish clothing pressing into me from the front, I felt more trapped than I ever had in my life. I reached up to tug at my collar, but my fingers gently brushed across the little lacy edges of the Peter Pan collar, and then against the topmost pearl button. Such girly things to feel. And I knew that to the nurse, I probably looked like a girl appreciating her lovely pretty clothing, rather than a boy feeling more terror and humiliation than he could even begin to process. I wanted to shout at her, I wanted to scream, "I feel horrible. I don't want to be a girl. You're treating me like I'm a pretty little girl, but I'm not. I'm a boy, and I hate this. I hate playing dress up." But I remained silent. She finished buttoning me up, and clapped excitedly, oohing and awing. "Oh, you're so pretty," the nurse said. "Do you like dressing up in such pretty little clothes?" That crossed a line for me. I looked in her eyes, furious and ready to unleash all my rage on her. But I saw that she was really just trying to make a horrible day better for me. How could you yell at someone who looks at you with kindness, and who has taken time out of her day specifically to take care of you? I couldn't be ungrateful, and I couldn't make her feel guilty. So all I said was, "I still feel sick, but I feel much better." And, actually, that was true. The medicine was doing its job, and I wasn't feeling quite so feverish as when I was stuck in the bathroom with nothing but girly clothing to wear. Now I was slightly more lucid, and still with nothing but girly clothing to wear. "I'm glad to hear that," the nurse said. "Just a few more details to take care of." She began rummaging around in the basket again, apparently intent on finding something she had seen while picking up in the bathroom. I felt my legs grow weak, and I sat down on the couch, exhausted by the mere thought of it. Even as my fevered brain was regaining its faculties, the realization of what was happening to me deepened into terror of what I knew must eventually happen. When my mother arrived, this nurse would learn that I had lied to her. From her perspective, it would seem like I was a boy who lied so that he could dress up as a girl. I hoped and prayed that Miss Annie had noticed how uncomfortable I was, that she could explain things to the nurse and my parents. Unless, of course, she was responsible for this whole ordeal. And as my fever cleared, I realized with even more clarity what it truly meant that the nurse thought I was a girl. I had always thought of myself as a boy, and other people did me the courtesy of agreeing. But this woman thought of me as a girl. It wasn't her fault, which made it all even worse, because I couldn't hate her as my enemy. She was my friend. She was trying to help me. "Drink your water, dear," the nurse said. "We're just going to make you a prettiest little girl for when your mom arrives, okay? Here's the first thing we need to complete your look," she said, and held up a loose wad of white. "What is that?" "These are tights, silly," she giggled. "Have you never worn tights before?" "And no," I said, hoping this would dissuade her from making me wear them. "Oh, it'll make you feel so girly and cute," she said cheerfully, and began rolling each leg up into a bundle. I watched her do it, the horror dawning on me that she was going to slip my feet into those bundles, and then draw them all the way up my legs. I had seen girls in tights before, and always wondered how high they went, and now I would know firsthand. "Can you stand, or would you like to hold your legs out for me?" the nurse said, kindly. I could have stood. I had the physical strength, but for some reason, it just seemed easier in that moment to hold out my legs. Nothing could have prepared me for the humiliation of watching as the nurse pulled my legs onto her lap, and slipped each of my feet into the tights and then pulled them up, smoothing out my legs into an opaque white shape. Looking down at myself, the only things remaining of myself were my arms and hands. Every other inch of me was hidden by girly clothing. I thought of kicking and protesting, of shouting that I didn't want to wear tights, but the nurse was so happy thinking that she was making me happy. How could I rob her of that? She pulled them all the way up, to my thighs, and then stopped. She couldn't go any higher, so I thought she was done, but without warning she lifted my legs up higher, lifting my panty-clad butt off the couch. With a swift movement, she yanked the white tights up over my thighs, my crotch, so that the waistband rested just above my belly button. With a few more tugs, she secured the tights in place. She did it quickly to preserve my modesty, but the sudden shock of feeling my whole crotch area just compressed, flattened in a single moment like that, sent shudders through my body. I squirmed my legs a little bit and felt the tights slide against each other, flowing smoothly against the fabric of the slip. Now, she told me, starting at your feet, run your hands up your legs to make sure there are no wrinkles. She lowered my legs gently and said, waiting for me to comply, which I had no choice but to do. I ran my hands up my legs, compressed and hidden by these opaque white tights. As I ran my hands up I found a few folds and wrinkles, and I smoothed them out, running my hands all the way up under my skirt to feel my crotch, just to make sure my private parts were still there. For a horrified moment, I couldn't feel them. I actually had become a girl. But then I realized they were still there, just compressed down to almost nothing. You know, Cinderella was always my favorite too, she said with a wink. It took me a moment to realize why she was saying that. Because of course, she had seen Cinderella dancing right there on my panties. I love the idea of wearing a tattered dress that simply transforms into the most beautiful ball gown, with you still inside it. Cinderella isn't my favorite, I said, a little too harshly. Oh, the nurse looked hurt. I mean, I heard myself backpedaling just to spare the nurse's feelings. She would be my favorite, but I like Belle more. It was something I had heard my sister say, so I just parroted it to try to keep up the appearances of being a normal little girl for as long as possible. I just like that Belle loves reading, because it's important for girls to read. You're so right, the nurse nodded, as if I had said something profound. I wanted to keep her happy, so I kept talking, still just reciting the kind of essays my sister would deliver at the dining room table. She's the first Disney princess that encourages girls to be smart as well as pretty, I went on, still using my sister's words. Well, I'm so glad young girls today have such lovely role models, the nurse said. Now let's add the final touches. There's more? I said. Oh, you're quite nearly perfect, the nurse said, misinterpreting my tone as excitement. But here. She leaned forward, holding a hairband with a little bow on it in her hands. Do you like it? It's so girly, I said, trying to keep the shame and horror out of my voice. Oh, you're so excited, the nurse laughed and leaned forward and slipped into my hair, brushing it away from my eyes. Do I look? I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to ask for confirmation because I already knew it. If I looked in a mirror right now, even I wouldn't think of myself as a boy. I would be a girl, and even when I started wearing boys' clothes again, I knew that a part of me would always remember looking in a mirror and seeing a girl, of standing there in a slip and panties and tights and a blouse and a little green plaid pinafore dress. How could any boy recover from that? See for yourself, the nurse turned aside. There was a full-length mirror hanging on the wall behind her, between the scale and the height chart. I saw myself. The look of mild shock on my face registered more as feminine enchantment. My fear of the nurse seeing that I had boy parts was making me clench my legs together. The pose, my knees together with my feet apart, looked just perfectly girly, just as the nurse had promised. Over my knees, encased in white tights, draped the hem of the pinafore dress, and visible just beneath it a hint of the slip. I stood hastily, hating being able to see as well as feel it. That was a mistake. As I stood, the skirt and slip swung from my body, prompting the nurse to say, "Give me a spin," with an excited round of clapping. My cheeks went beet red, but I obeyed, and watched and felt as my slip and my dress flared out wide at my waist. "Isn't that ever so much fun?" the nurse giggled. "Yes. Yes, so much fun," I said, choking back tears but only sounding breathless with excitement. I stared at myself in the mirror again, still trying to process everything. The blouse conspired to give my shoulders and face a cherubic softness, and the pinafore dress, gathered at the waist and draping down, made me look and feel exactly like the girls I always noticed at holiday performances at school or on Sundays at church. I always thought about how uncomfortable it must be to get dressed up like that, to wear a pretty little dress and be unable to run around and play. They always seemed above it all, as if their flawless girlhood kept them somehow separate from me. Seeing myself in the mirror not just dressed like one of those girls, but as one of those girls for I could find no single hint of a boy in my reflection did nothing to bridge that separation. Instead, it put my own self-image on the other side of that gulf. Seeing my image was now like looking at an alien. "Last thing," the nurse said, and I turned to her, mouth open wide in utter terror. What more could she do to me? I looked in the mirror and saw only girliness. I only saw femininity, cuteness, softness. I saw myself prancing around, a little prissy girl who didn't like to get dirty, who hated the thought of grass stains on her pristine white tights. When I saw myself, I saw the kind of girl who I could never be friends with, who wouldn't play anything other than house or throwing tea parties for her friends and all their dolls. When I looked at myself, and knew that at a moment's notice, I could become that girl, my body was racked with sheer panic. "I found these at the bottom of the basket," the nurse said. "So no more sneakers for you, miss." She held in her hands a pair of shiny black Mary Janes, with a very slight kitten heel. "One foot at a time, just like Cinderella," the nurse said. Trembling, feeling trapped with nowhere else to go, no other options, I stepped softly towards the nurse. Once again, my humiliation served to make me seem even more girly. I took small mincing steps, patting gently with white tights. I held out my right foot, and the nurse slipped the appropriate shoe onto my foot. "Perfect," she said. "Oh, how lovely." I felt like crying as she buckled it securely at my ankles. I shook my foot experimentally, and felt no give at all. The shoe really did fit perfectly. Once buckled, my feet wouldn't shift, but neither were they in any way cramped. It's like these shoes, matched in femininity only by everything else I was wearing, were made for me. I wouldn't be able to slip out of them quickly. It felt like the universe wanted me to be a girl, and to be unable to escape it. I bit my tongue to stop myself from yelping like a wounded animal. Other foot," the nurse called out eagerly. I leaned on her shoulder for balance, and lifted my left foot, and the same horrible process was repeated. A perfect fit, and a secure buckle, and when I placed my feet back on the ground, I stood an inch taller than I had before. "There you are." The nurse took my hand and pulled me closer to the mirror, giving me a closer look at all I was wearing. On my head was a girly headband that sparkled in the light, and placed a bow at an adorable angle on the left side of my head. My face remained unchanged, but that hardly seemed to matter given that it rested atop a little round Peter Pan collar, and framed by two puff sleeves that seemed bigger when I was standing this close to the mirror. I reached up with each hand and touched them, and again found them to be surprisingly expansive. I realized that the fabric of the blouse had bunched up on the armholes of the pinafore dress, making them seem so much larger than before. Beneath the Peter Pan collar was a neat row of little pearl buttons, only two of them visible before the front of the pinafore dress wrapped around my narrow torso. Every movement reminded me of what I was wearing. Beneath the dress and blouse, overwhelming though they were, was always the undercurrent of the slip. It was the medium through which I felt all the other garments. It made them softer, smoother, even girlier, as if they needed that. When I turned my consciousness to my crotch, I couldn't feel anything there anymore. If I wiggled back and forth, I could feel fabric cupping me tightly, double layers of it, with the lace trim of the panties tickling me beneath the gentle pressure of my tights. The tights just completed the job the panties began, flattening my front completely, leaving no hint at all that I was supposed to be a boy. I couldn't feel anything at all. I wanted to claw at my private parts, but I knew I couldn't without exposing myself as a sissy boy. So I had to stand there, enduring the horrible sensation of missing something. At the waist, the green plaid pinafore dress flared out, its pleated skirt flaring ever so slightly with the shape of the heavy slip. It was an image of perfect feminine innocence. I imagined myself sitting in a quiet room, reading a book, just like Belle. The thought made me smile, for a split second, before I realized all that it entailed. I was accepting it. I was examining myself in the mirror and accepting the girl I found there. As my examination continued, I forced myself into a critical gaze, forced myself to remember that this was an awful, horrible thing that had happened to me. I hated the feeling of tights, and I hated the way my legs simply appeared beneath the hem of the skirt. I missed the sight of pants on my body. I wanted to be able to look at myself and see a boy, see someone who could run and jump and climb. I didn't want to see this girl, who looked like she was ready to sit for a portrait, or have tea served to her. Whichever way I turned, I looked more and more feminine, with each of my tiny steps accompanied by a little click of the heels, and my skirts swaying back and forth with my body. I was a perfect image of feminine innocence. There was nothing I could do to convince myself as I stood and shifted from one pose to the next that I wasn't a girl. It was a terrifying thing to realize, to feel my boyhood ripped so suddenly away from me, but it would have been even worse to reveal to anyone that I was a boy. To be a boy who dressed up like a pretty, prissy, delicate girl was far worse than just being a girl. So nobody could ever find out, and yet. As I stared at myself in the mirror, I heard a knock on the door. Hello? I'm so sorry I'm late. I'm here to pick up Steven. It was my mom. Steven, the nurse turned, while I ducked out of sight. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. He goes by Steph, my mom said. The nurse froze. Your child is. Steph, the nurse said, short for. Steven. Yeah, my mom took a step forward, eyes suddenly wide. Wait, is something wrong? Is he still here? Is he? The nurse stepped aside, and my mom moved past her, and suddenly I had nowhere to hide. My mom stared at me for a long moment, face twisting through a series of emotions I couldn't quite process. All I understood was that something bad had happened here, and suddenly it all came flooding out. I ran to my mother, bursting into tears, and hugged her as tightly as I could around the waist, sobbing and sobbing. What the hell is this? My mom's arms wrapped tightly around me, pressing me into her, and suddenly I felt safe. It was less her hug, and more the anger in her voice. She was defending me, protecting me. I hugged her so tight, as if she was the path back to being a normal boy. I can explain, the nurse said. I'm not sure, but I think I know what. No, my mom said, voice growing louder and sharper. You're going to explain to me exactly why my son is dressed like a girl. Is this your idea of a joke? Were you punishing him? What did you do? And as she finally began full-on screaming at the trembling nurse, this woman who did nothing but try to make a sick little girl happy, my mother pulled me in even tighter, her arms crushing the puff sleeves of my blouse against my shoulders, still shaking with tears. I was trying to speak, trying to help the nurse explain how none of it was her fault, but I wasn't helping, only choking out things like, I didn't want to wear a dress. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It was utter chaos, for a good long while. My dad was called, and came in full-on lawyer mode, and then Ms. Annie had to drive back to the school to help explain everything. I still suspected that she had tricked the nurse into treating me like a girl, but I had no evidence, and the nurse didn't present any either. The whole ordeal took hours, and the whole time, nobody brought up anything about me changing. My parents were furious at Ms. Annie and the nurse, but once they got over the initial shock, and once my tears subsided and I could begin to explain things, the more they calmed down. The whole situation was nobody's fault, except perhaps mine, and the church's for not keeping better track of their donations. The night wore on, with the nurse offering me apology after apology, telling me how very sorry she was, how she had never for a second thought that I was a boy, which didn't help very much. Ms. Annie hugged me, and thanked me for being so brave and helping explain things, and then more adults arrived. Ms. Annie had summoned people from the church, counselors that I was horrified to recognize as some of the people who taught me in Sunday school. And here I was, dressed just perfectly like a girl going to Sunday school. The thought of it made me sick with worry, and I began fidgeting and squirming as the counselors sat down with me and my family, asking question after question to make sure I was okay, and that nobody had hurt me. I couldn't figure out how to explain to them that the worst part of everything was how much attention people were paying to me. Everyone kept talking about poor Stephen, poor me. I had suffered so much, and I was so brave for enduring it without complaining, but I just wanted to go home and take off all these clothes and forget it ever happened. As I fidgeted, my mother began stroking my back, pressing all 3 layers pinafore dress, blouse, and slip together. I squirmed against the feeling, but her hand stroked quickly and smoothly, and I was soon fast asleep. I woke up as my dad was carrying me out to the car. Feeling his arms supporting me, cradling me, I felt safe for the first time all day. And then he shifted me in his arms, and it all came rushing back. I was still dressed like a girl. Every inch of me swaddled in the most girlish things imaginable. I knew what I must look like to anyone who could see. I looked like a sleepy, pretty little daddy's girl, safe and comfortable. Again, my urge was to fight, to protest, to struggle out of my dad's arms so I could walk, because I was a mature, cool, 6-year-old boy. Didn't anyone remember that? "Dad, I can walk," I said. "Okay, if that's what you want," my dad said. My mom was walking next to us, and spoke up, "Be careful on the asphalt, your heels might get." I suddenly realized that I was still in those horrible Mary Janes, those horrible feminine shoes with their little heels, meant to prepare me for wearing higher and higher heels as I got older, until at last I was a grown woman wearing stilettos with her elegant dresses. I didn't want to have to walk in them. But it was too late. My dad put me down, and I found my footing. We were still on the sidewalk outside the school, so the ground wasn't too rough, but as I walked, I could feel myself wobbling slightly, not used to the feeling of my feet slightly elevated. Even worse was the sound, the little clicking taps of my shoes on the cement. My dad took me to my mom's car, and helped me into my seat, pulling my skirts aside so he could buckle me up. The strap passed across my lap and my chest, pressing all of it close to me once more. "I'm gonna go get the stuff," my mom said, and headed back for the school. "What's she getting?" I asked. "Oh, she agreed to wash the clothes that you wore," my dad said. I started dozing off again, and when I woke up again, the car was in motion. I wanted to demand answers as to what was going on. The seat beside me was covered in a pile of clothes, far more than just the ones I had worn. I pretended to be asleep, and very carefully ran a hand through the pile. With dawning horror, I realized that the pile of clothes across which I was now laying was the entire basket of clothing I had been forced to dig through, the basket of clothing that had turned me into a girl. My exploring hand found the party dress, and I withdrew as if bitten by a snake. The petticoats rustled, and my mom looked back from the driver's seat. My eyes were wide open with fear, and she smiled at me. "Don't worry, Stephen," she said. "Your dad and I both know that it wasn't your fault. Are we keeping the dresses?" I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. My greatest fear at that moment was that my dad had lied to me, that we were keeping the clothes because they had decided they liked me better as a girl. "We're taking them home to wash them," my mom explained. "They're meant for donations, though, so that's where they're going to go, in the end. Unless..." My stomach tightened with fear. "Would you want to keep them?" my mom asked. "No," I said, finally happy that someone just asked me. I hate all these feelings. I don't like feeling like a girl, even if the nurse was nice to me. I just went along with it because I was so embarrassed. But I hate it, especially these shoes, and these tights, and the underwear. "Please, Mom, please don't make me keep the dresses." "We'd never make you do anything," my mom said. At long last, we got home, and I trudged inside. "Oh, there you guys are," my sister called from the living room. I bolted for the stairs, but she was already walking towards us. Exhausted by the day, I tripped on the stairs and fell, my little kitten heels kicking in the air, and my dress and slip riding up, giving my sister a full view of everything. Whoa! Ha ha ha! What is this? She exclaimed, descending on me. She straightened out my slip and skirt and helped me to my feet, forcing my hands up so she could examine me. Oh my God, look at those shoes! That headband! Oh my God! Enough, my mom snapped at her. Your brothers had a really hard day, okay? Yeah, my sister looked at me again, more thoughtfully. Yeah, I can see that. Sorry, Steph. It's okay, Mia, I sighed and climbed the rest of the stairs more carefully. I struggled to undress in my room, with growing despair when Mia entered behind me. You look so cute, she said. I know you don't want to hear it, but it's true. Mia, please help me. I sobbed at her. I can't get the dress off. Aw, Mia smiled at me. That's so sweet. The little girl needs help getting changed. Mia, Mom said you can't make fun of me. Oh, fine, she said. I turned around, and she unbuttoned the back of the dress, and then left again. I dropped it on the floor, and then practically tore the blouse off, followed by the slip. I had to sit on the floor and really work to unbuckle the shoes, but at last, I got them off. I peeled the tights away and kicked the panties off, and I was free. I practically skipped to my underwear drawer and grabbed the first pair of boxers I could see, and then I put on a t-shirt and I shook my hair out, and left the headband on the floor. Finally devoid of all the girly things I had been made to wear, I went to the bathroom to see myself. I saw a boy again, and so, at last, exhausted, I fell into bed and slept for a long time.